Hello, World History students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 27, Section 4. And Chapter 27 is about the interwar years, and Section 4 is primarily about the dictators in Europe. So follow along as we talk. Kind of to give you an overview, before we kind of dive into the notes, we need to talk a little bit about probably the four big dictators that were in Europe at the time of the 1930s. And we're going to start with the obvious, Adolf Hitler. You kind of know a little bit about his rise to power, maybe from other history classes. This is a guy who, for the most part, was actually from Austria, served in the German army during World War I, and eventually is going to rule Germany during the 1930s and into the 40s. A little bit south, we have a guy that's probably a little more unknown to most history students. This is a guy who became the dictator of Spain. His name was Francisco Franco, and he was a fascist. He came to power during the Spanish Civil War during the 1930s, had a lot of support from both Germany and Italy to rise to power. But what's interesting is, unlike some of these other dictators that we're going to talk about, Franco would stay in power the longest. He would hold power in Spain, making Spain a fascist state until the 1970s. In Italy, we had a guy named Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, out of some of our dictators, is really kind of the first to come to power. He comes to power in the 1920s and kind of had an interesting fate. He had at one point in time been kind of a quasi-communist, and at some point in time he kind of flips and becomes a fascist. And if you know anything about fascism and communism, they really are kind of like opposites. And then finally, speaking of communism, we have to talk about Joseph Stalin. You know, the interesting thing here is Stalin, even though he's a dictator, he's going to be part of the Allies at some point in time during the Second World War. But Stalin was, he was a tyrant. He was very authoritarian. He called for the executions of some of his supporters. So this is a guy that, even though he might have sided with the Allies during the war, he's still kind of a bad guy deep down. So let's talk a little bit about our dictators. We're going to start with number one here, Benito Mussolini, sometimes known as El Duce, or the leader in Italian. He ruled Italy as an all-powerful leader of a totalitarian government. Mussolini came to power in the 1920s, kind of ousting the monarchy of Italy at that time. Was promising all sorts of economic reforms, kind of during a time of economic instability. One of the things that he did during his time as the dictator of Italy before the beginning of the Second World War was that Italy did invade the country of Ethiopia. And if you remember back, Ethiopia was one of those nations, probably the only nation in the continent of Africa, that had not been colonized by a European power. Italy tried to do so, and so they invaded Ethiopia because they wanted to show their military strength and to expand Italy's territory. In the Soviet Union, we had Joseph Stalin. Stalin came to power after Vladimir Lenin's death. And he had been kind of in the inner circle of Lenin. He kind of fought for power. And what's interesting is that, you know, even though Lenin was kind of a tough guy, kind of ruthless at times, Stalin takes that up a notch. He ruled with violence, fear, and he used a lot of propaganda to make that all happen. His goal, for the most part, were put into what is known as 5-year plans. And not only are you going to see 5-year plans in the Soviet Union, you're going to see 5-year plans in places like communist China eventually. But in this first 5-year plan, he had a goal of modernizing the Soviet economy by increasing in Soviet industrial output. In 1932, Ukraine, for the most part, one of the republics that make up the Soviet Union, was not necessarily being very cooperative with Joseph Stalin. And as a way to punish them, Stalin basically was not sending them the appropriate rations and supplies that they needed. And what ends up happening is many Ukrainians, particularly the peasants, face starvation because they resisted what it was known as collectivization. This whole idea that farmers should farm together and basically be told what kind of yields and what to produce by the government. Stalin refused to send any type of food, and eventually famine set in, and we have widespread deaths that occur as a result of this. Farm ownership differed under Lenin and Stalin. Stalin, or Lenin for this part, gave land to the peasants, while Stalin took land back and placed it under government control. And when the peasants resisted Stalin's move, he executed thousands of them or sent them to labor camps. And labor camps in the Soviet Union were sometimes known as gulags. Particularly the ones in Siberia were really, really, really bad. During the mid-1930s, Stalin started what would be known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror, either way. Part of this was to get rid of people or things that he considered to be undesirable. Some of the people that he, for the most part, was purging were actually supporters of the Communist Party, individuals who had shown support to Stalin himself. But I think Stalin had this paranoia that these people were becoming a little too powerful and might challenge his authority, so he had them executed. We're going to talk about Germany here in a minute, but to kind of lead into this, I want to talk about what was happening with the German economy right after the end of World War I. You might remember the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which was a real punishment to the German people. So if you take a look at the German mark, which is their form of currency, okay, the number of marks to American dollars is kind of what this chart is talking about. So for every mark, it would take basically $4.2 in 1914, so it's kind of at the start of World War I. By 1919, after the war had wrapped up, for every mark, it would basically account for $14. And then eventually it goes onward. So by the time we get to the 1920s, you can see how we have this staggering inflation that's going to take place. So to buy something like a loaf of bread literally would take a wheelbarrow full of money. And what ends up happening is we have an economic depression that's going to set in. And in a way, it's kind of like a Great Depression, kind of like how we experienced that in the 1930s, except for maybe a decade sooner for the German people. So in number 7, after World War I, the Weimar Republic ruled Germany. This Weimar Republic was kind of formed out of the Treaty of Versailles. It was going to try to make Germany into a republic, kind of a democracy. But it was really unstable, and part of that has to do with the economy. So in the early 20s, inflation soared, and many saw that their savings was going to be wiped out. Born in Austria, we had this guy named Adolf Hitler that had served in the German army. Matter of fact, he had been decorated for his valor in combat, rose to the rank of a corporal, which isn't really all that high in the military when you talk about enlisted men. But after the war, he was devastated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. He felt like Germany had been harshly punished for this war, and he ends up joining a group known as the National Socialist. This is a party that was formed before Adolf Hitler even joined it. The National Socialist Party would eventually be known as the Nazi Party, and he would go and listen to speakers, and eventually he himself would become one of their speakers and kind of get wrapped up in all of this. By 1923, Hitler had been, basically kind of promoted through the ranks of the Nazi Party, and eventually he stages kind of a kind of a demonstration. And as a result of the failed attempt to overthrow the government in 1923, Hitler is basically sent to jail. And while he's in jail, he pens his book known as Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, translated in English, means My Struggle. And it's basically filled with all of his political ideas and beliefs. And this idea that he believed that the German people were racially superior to a lot of other ethnic groups. You hear things about anti-Semitism, and you kind of learn a little bit about maybe what's motivating Hitler in some of his actions. Down below here we have some pictures. Hitler as a child, Hitler with some of his buddies during World War I, and eventually Hitler in the 1920s as he's kind of rising through the ranks of the Nazi Party. When we talk about some of the things that are going to happen, after Adolf Hitler comes to power, and just so you understand, Hitler is actually elected, and so it's not like the Nazis, for the most part, kind of bullied their way into power, but in a way that they were elected through free elections. And one of the things that the German people are going to want to do is to kind of rearm themselves. Some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles was to eliminate some of their military hardware, the size of the military, things like tanks and aircraft, and eventually the U-boats were all kind of like mothballed for the most part. So in 1933, which is the year that Adolf Hitler comes to power, and it's also the same year that Franklin Roosevelt, who is going to be the president of the United States during the duration of the war, is elected, you can kind of see in millions of dollars kind of what was happening. The German military, not necessarily not producing things for their government, but they're below the United States. And as we move to about 1935, you can see the staggering jump that's going to take place in the German military as far as the amount of money that they're spending. Part of that has to do with a treaty that is signed in the 1930s with Great Britain. And Germany at that time was complaining that they thought that they were in a situation where they might be attacked by the Soviet Union, this fear of communism. And so some of the parties that had signed the Treaty of Versailles allowed the German people to start building submarines and building up their aircraft and, in a sense, rearming themselves, which is kind of ironic considering how dangerous they thought the Germans were at the end of the war. Number 9, when Hitler took control of Germany, he began the German military rebuilding process and the rebuilding of their economy. And the rebuilding of the economy was primarily through the building up of the military. This was achieved through government spending on public works programs that helped reduce unemployment, but much of the spending was obviously on rearmament. One of the things that comes out of this public works, and it's probably one of the more famous things that that we talk about in regards to Germany, is this whole notion of the Autobahn, Germany's superhighway. This is actually kind of part of this military vision, this idea of being able to move troops quickly to the borders via the highways. When we talk about reparations, some of the payments are going to be deferred. In other words, are going to be canceled out. The United States was one of those countries that basically said Germany wouldn't have to pay us back. So this kind of gives Germany an opportunity, I guess, to kind of get their feet on the ground militarily. Number 10, the hostility towards or prejudice towards Jews is called anti-Semitism. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed that created a separate legal status for German Jews. It eliminated their citizenship. It took away their civil and private property rights. It took away their voting rights. It limited their right to work in certain occupations. This was the start. And then a catalyst that really kind of gets things going is an event known as Kristallnacht, which was remembered because of the violence that was aimed primarily at Jews. It's not going to be long after this that we're going to start seeing Jews being removed to ghettos, and you know, all the atrocities that we're eventually going to talk about when it comes time for the Holocaust. Thank you very much.